Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander, and the experience I wish to share happened with a colleague named Armando and me. We became good friends while working at a morgue, which I am about to tell you about. Both of us are forensic doctors, and at that time, we were younger and had little experience in the profession. However, we were both passionate about what we did. We met at the morgue itself, and Armando had started working there shortly before me. When I joined, it was surprisingly easy to get the job, and as we talked, I realized he was relieved to have help on the night shift. Sometimes, there wasn't enough time to finish the work, especially when many bodies arrived in a single day, and he had to examine them all. I must say that this job was very challenging for me. Being a forensic doctor in Brazil at that time, amidst frequent conflicts, was not easy at all. You're never fully prepared to witness what we saw every day. There were bodies that arrived in pieces or with faces completely disfigured. The saddest aspect was that not all of them were adults. We had to deal with many children who lost their lives in unspeakable ways due to their parents' decisions. The morgue was always crowded day and night, with ambulances constantly bringing in bodies. On one occasion, Armando and I were working alone. We were busy examining several bodies that night, and the place was so full that we had to put these bodies on stretchers in the same room where the freezers were while we continued our work in the room next door. As we worked, we started to hear the sound of freezer doors creaking, the same sound they make when you open or close them. I went to check, but I noticed that all of them were closed. Armando asked me what was happening, and I told him I didn't know, that all the doors were closed and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We both looked perplexed, but we continued working, without time for speculation. A short time passed, and we heard that creaking sound again, but this time we also heard a door being slammed. Armando and I immediately ran to the room. I confess that I was a bit scared. However, we were surprised when we got there because the door to that room was locked. We tried to force it, but we couldn't, and we didn't have the key to the room. The doctor who worked there in the morning was responsible for the keys. We would lock the room from the inside when we left, and the doctor would unlock it in the morning. When we arrived at night, the door was already open, so we had no need for a key. Armando suggested that we call the police, but I questioned the need, stating that no one could have entered since there was no one alive inside. He looked at me skeptically, as was his custom. Our profession prepares us to be skeptical, but sometimes inexplicable things happen, even without logic. We decided to return to work in the next room, and I agreed with Armando that we should continue working as if nothing abnormal was happening. I told him that the people in that room weren't good in life, losing their lives while doing terrible things. They couldn't transcend, and I was sure they were trying to scare us. Armando, on the other hand, couldn't understand how I could believe in paranormal things while working in this profession. I explained to him that it was perfectly possible when you experience something paranormal. You have no choice but to believe. Moreover, I had already gone through supernatural experiences during my childhood. My grandmother was very spiritual and used to tell us that people who were bad in life and lost their lives would get stuck in some kind of limbo, not knowing where they were. Often, they were tormented by evil beings who avoided them. I could verify this while telling him all of this when we heard the cry of a man coming from the locked room. Armando began to get very nervous, which was unusual for him because he was always very professional and didn't believe in anything that couldn't be scientifically explained. However, his expression changed as the lament continued. He wanted to check it out. We both left the room and approached the door. When I tried to listen through the door, it opened by itself. The room's lights were off, although we had left them on as usual. Armando tried to turn on the light, but it was too dark to find the switch. I decided to enter the room in the dark and took a few steps forward. I can't express how heavy the atmosphere was in that place, something I had never felt in my entire career. I could feel the anguish and despair of those lost souls. I was surrounded by bodies that had met terrible ends, and many of them weren't even whole. It was simply inexplicable what I felt in the complete darkness, surrounded by those terrible energies. Finally, Armando managed to turn on the light, and the first thing we saw was a body completely off the stretcher. It was the body of a man with part of his nose stitched up by Armando, who had reconstructed his disfigured face. We couldn't explain how that had happened. Armando began to have a cold sweat and panic, and I could see that he was genuinely worried. As the night wore on, we realized our shift was almost over. Armando was still shaken by what had happened that night, while I wasn't as affected, as I had experienced similar incidents before. The following night, I got ready for work as usual. Armando told me he could barely sleep and was worried about what had happened, saying he felt guilty because, in our profession, we shouldn't be affected by these things. However, we are human beings, and often we can't help but have these feelings when things like this occur. I tried to reassure him and said that the night would be normal and that we should focus on our work, avoiding thinking about what had happened. I believe that our minds could attract what we thought and feared. Around 2 a.m., we received the body of a 5-year-old child who had died in a hospital due to an accident. The hospital sent the body to us because they had no more space. We placed the child in a waiting room, planning to perform the autopsy later. Armando and I were busy examining another body when we heard the cry of a small child coming from the room where the child was. Armando became visibly irritated, but I decided to check. I walked to the room, and when I opened the door, I saw that the body bag of the child was completely open, exposing the child's body, which seemed to have an expression of terror. I immediately closed the bag and brought the body to where we were working. Armando was frustrated with the situation and asked me what I was doing because it wasn't yet time to examine the body. I explained that I couldn't leave that poor boy in the room alone, surrounded by all those energies. I was sure that they were disturbing the boy just as they had done with the man the night before. That night, we didn't hear any more cries, but we did hear several strange noises that we couldn't identify. We no longer had the courage to check what was happening and agreed that we shouldn't give any more attention to it to avoid those entities continuing to disturb us. As the days and nights passed, the room where the strange events occurred began to empty, since many bodies were not claimed by anyone and were buried in mass graves. The strange noises gradually diminished, and Armando was the first to notice that things had returned to normal. I admitted it, and we sighed, continuing our work more calmly. The days that followed were difficult, with new bodies arriving, victims of confrontations or suicides, and we knew that this would cause chaos in the place. However, we seemed to be getting more and more used to that environment. I was afraid of becoming increasingly insensitive because after everything we saw and experienced in this job, there is no going back. I believe that for anyone who wants to pursue this profession, especially in a country where terrible things happen, it is necessary to be well prepared psychologically. I send a warm hug to all my colleagues. Your dedication and work are admirable. I've been wanting to share this story that marked my professional life for a long time, but I had doubts out of respect for the victim. I only want to share it anonymously, omitting details, and with deep respect for her and her family. I've been a forensic pathologist for 9 years, and I've worked in various morgues throughout my career. I've handled 2 cases that became viral in several cities, where my expertise was required to clarify unresolved situations. On one occasion, I was called to another country for an unsolved case where they needed my help. It involved the exhumation of a young woman's body for a new autopsy. The family was not satisfied with the official cause of death that the prosecution had declared. It wasn't my first time dealing with exhumed bodies, so I felt confident everything would go smoothly. I hoped to help the family who, when I met them, begged me to find the true cause of their daughter's death. They just wanted peace, both for themselves and for her. The young woman's husband had found her hanged in their home where they lived together. The authorities claimed that she had taken her own life, but the parents did not believe this. They knew she wasn't suffering from psychological problems and had plans for the future, like her dream of becoming a mother that same year. Her husband, a caring and loving man, also agreed to the exhumation of his wife's body. I signed off so that the process could begin as soon as possible. The day came, and that night I arrived at the morgue where I was to examine the young woman. I prefer to work alone, so I waited until the place was empty before starting. Everything seemed to confirm the cause of death that the prosecution had declared. I was almost finished when the young woman grabbed my hand. I know it's hard to believe, but it happened. I remember standing still, with her cold hand on mine, shocked, trying to understand what was happening. I was afraid she had moved due to muscle spasms, but her body was too far into decomposition for that to be possible. I was about to remove my gloves when she grabbed my hand again. I was stunned, denying that this could be real since she had been dead for weeks. I quickly wrapped things up and left for my lodging. The young woman's body remained at the morgue and would be reburied the next day. I arrived at my room, confused and a little frightened. I had never experienced anything like that in my career. It didn't make sense. I took a shower to relax and was about to lie down when I heard noises outside the bathroom, inside my room. This seemed very strange since I was alone and had locked all the doors. I turned off the shower to listen better, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. But in the silence, I clearly heard footsteps in my room. I grabbed my towel and cautiously stepped out, fearing an intruder had entered my lodging. Upon checking the room, I found it empty. I knew it wasn't my imagination. I had clearly heard footsteps. I dressed quickly and went downstairs to check the first floor. Everything was locked just as I had left it. I went back upstairs and locked myself in my room. Returning to the bathroom, something felt off, a strange presence behind me. My skin tingled with fear for no apparent reason, and I was terrified to look in the mirror in front of me, afraid of seeing something that would make me scream. I stood there with my head down, my hands gripping the sink, frozen in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to resist the overwhelming fear. Slowly, I lifted my head when I felt ready. When I finally opened my eyes, there she was, the young woman I had performed the autopsy on earlier that day. She stood in front of me, but not as she had been in the morgue, decayed and lifeless. Instead, she appeared as a translucent version of herself. She looked at me with tear-filled eyes and an expression of sorrow like nothing I'd ever seen. It lasted only a few seconds, but my heart raced as if it was about to burst from my chest. When I turned around, she was gone. I started crying. I had never seen a ghost or anything supernatural before, especially not of someone whose autopsy I had conducted. I realized that she was trying to tell me something, that she wanted me to continue searching for the truth. That's why she had followed me to my lodging. I quickly dressed and grabbed my things, heading back to the morgue, where I spent the rest of the night re-examining her body. Eventually, I found something I hadn't noticed before. She had been asphyxiated before being hanged. She hadn't taken her own life. Someone else had done it. I was shocked by this turn in the investigation. The young woman just wanted justice. The next day, I submitted my report. When the family learned of this, they were furious with the prosecution for not having done their job properly. They were also dissatisfied with me for not doing mine efficiently the first time. They demanded that the responsible party be found. It didn't take long before the real culprit was identified. When they read my report, the young woman's husband fled the city, and the story began to unravel. He had been the one to assault her and then hang her in an attempt to make it look like suicide. Sadly, this is more common than we think. The young woman finally got the justice she had longed for. Her husband was found, and he confessed to the crime. While I was relieved to have helped solve the case and ensured she could rest in peace, the experience left me with bittersweet feelings. The memory of her appearance still echoes in my mind, but I can take comfort in knowing she finally found the peace she sought. And now, I've shared this experience, which still sends chills down my spine whenever I recall it.